My sister stole my inheritance, but years later she wanted a piece of my $1 million business and got exactly what she deserved. You know that feeling when you're watching a disaster movie and you think to yourself, man, at least I'm not that guy? Well, let me tell you something. I was that guy, and this isn't some Hollywood fiction with a happy ending guaranteed in 90 minutes. This is real life, where the credits don't roll when things get ugly, and the microwave quits working right when you need it most. My life collapsed faster than a house of cards in a tornado. I was sitting in a damp studio apartment that smelled like old pizza and broken dreams, staring at 2 beat-up suitcases that contained everything I owned in this world. The credit card that was piling up like snow in Buffalo, and I had this sinking feeling that the universe had decided to play poker with my life, but forgot to deal me any cards. But let me back up and tell you how I got there, because this story doesn't start with rock bottom. It starts with trust, the kind that only families can truly betray. You know, that Norman Rockwell painting kind of trust where everyone's sitting around the dinner table and life makes sense. My mom died when I was just a kid. Cancer took her when I was 8. After that, it was just me and Dad rattling around in our big old house in suburban Ohio. Dad was one of those classic American fathers who believed in hard work, keeping your word, and always having room at the table for one more. He used to tell me all the time, Jake, why throw money away on rent when you got a perfectly good home right here? This house is yours too, son. Save that money for your future. So that's what I did. While my friends were moving out, getting their own places, learning to be adults, I stayed home, worked dead-end jobs at the local hardware store and the diner downtown, saving every penny I could scrape together for college. Dad always said education was the one thing nobody could take away from you. Turns out he was wrong about a lot of things. I had this whole plan mapped out, you know? Community college first to save money, then transfer to Ohio State for business. Dad was proud of me for being practical, for thinking ahead. We'd sit on the front porch after dinner, talking about the future, about how I'd run my own business someday. He'd always end those conversations the same way. This house will be yours one day, Jake. You're building something here. Dad always believed we'd split things fairly when the time came. No need for lawyers or fancy paperwork. He trusted family to do right by family. Turns out, he overestimated our sense of justice by about 1,000,000 miles. Dad's heart attack came out of nowhere. One minute, he was laughing at some stupid joke on the evening news. The next minute, he was on the floor, and I was screaming for the paramedics. 62 years old, healthy as a horse, or so we thought. The doctor said it was massive. He probably didn't feel any pain. That was supposed to be comforting, but it just made me feel cheated. The funeral was a blur of casseroles and condolences. Everyone kept telling me how sorry they were, how Dad was in a better place now, and how I needed to stay strong. You know what nobody tells you about grief? It doesn't just hurt, it makes you stupid. Like, actually measurably dumber. Your brain turns to mush, and you can't think straight about anything, especially important stuff like legal documents and inheritance law. That's when my dear sweet sister Lizzie swooped in like a vulture in designer clothes. Now, Lizzie's always been the golden child, 3 years younger than me, but somehow always seemed older, smarter, more put together. While I was working at a hardware store with grease under my fingernails, she was in college studying communications and dating Brad, this smooth-talking pre-law student with perfect teeth and a handshake that felt more rehearsed than real. The day after the funeral, while I was still walking around like a zombie, Lizzie and Brad showed up with a briefcase full of papers. They sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where Dad and I used to eat breakfast and talk about my dreams, and started spreading out documents like they were dealing cards. Jake, Lizzie said in this soft, caring voice that should have been my first red flag, we need to talk about Dad's estate. There's some complicated legal stuff we need to sort out, and Brad's been helping me understand it all. Brad nodded sagely, like he was doing me some huge favor. The thing is, Jake, your father's was pretty straightforward, but there are some tax implications we need to address quickly. Time-sensitive stuff. I should have asked questions. I should have demanded to see Dad's actual will. Hell, I should have called my own lawyer. But grief had turned my brain into oatmeal, and these were family. the people I'd grown up believing would protect me. "It's just a formality," Lizzie assured me, her hand on my shoulder like she actually cared. "This just simplifies the probate process. Dad would have wanted us to handle this quickly and efficiently." The papers were full of legal jargon that might as well have been written in ancient Sanskrit. Terms like quitclaim deed and estate planning optimization and beneficiary restructuring. I was 23 years old, grief-stricken, and trusted my family to have my back. So I signed every single page without reading a damn word. Biggest mistake of my life. 3 weeks later, I found out what those papers actually said. Turns out I had voluntarily relinquished any and all claims to the family home and agreed to a revised distribution of estate assets. That left me with exactly nothing. Zero. Zip. Nada. The house where I grew up, where Dad taught me to ride a bike in the driveway, where Mom used to sing lullabies, it all belonged to Lizzie now. When I confronted her about it, standing in what used to be my living room, she just shrugged. "Jake, you signed the papers. It's all legal. Besides, I'm the one who's going to start a family soon. I need the stability. You're young, you'll figure something out." Brad, standing behind her like some kind of legal bodyguard, had the audacity to pat me on the back. "Think of it as motivation, buddy. Time to spread your wings and make your own way in the world. Every brick, every dollar, even Mom's old sewing machine, gone. Me? I got thrown out like yesterday's garbage, with family members whispering behind my back about how Jake never really amounted to much anyway. Apparently, working honest jobs and saving money for college wasn't amounting to much in their eyes. But wait, folks, the universe wasn't done with me yet. Because apparently, losing your home, your inheritance, and your family's respect all in 1 month wasn't enough drama for whatever cosmic screenwriter was penning my life story. That's when my relationship with Kate started falling apart too. Kate was supposed to be my anchor in all this chaos. We'd been together for 2 years, and I was planning to propose after I got my finances sorted out. She was a sweet, practical girl who worked at the bank downtown and always smelled like vanilla perfume. She had this way of making even bad days feel manageable, and I thought she was going to be my partner in building a new life in the ashes of my old one. Turns out, Kate's idea, for better or worse, had some pretty specific financial requirements attached to it. The conversation happened exactly 1 week after I got evicted from my own family home. I was crashing on Kate's couch temporarily, trying to figure out my next move, when she sat me down for a talk. You know it's never good news when someone needs to have a talk with you. "Jake," she said, avoiding eye contact like I was a car accident she didn't want to rubberneck it. "I've been thinking about us, about our future, and I just don't know if we want the same things anymore." Translation: you're broke and homeless, and that's not the life I signed up for. She told me I needed to find myself, that we just weren't right for each other anymore. Find myself? I couldn't even find a job or microwave that worked, let alone a sense of purpose. So there I was, homeless and newly single, scrambling to find somewhere to sleep. I managed to scrape together enough money for the security deposit on a studio apartment that was basically a glorified closet with a hot plate. The place smelled like desperation and old Chinese takeout, and the heater worked about as well as a politician's promise. A few days after moving into my new palace of sadness, I decided to hit Murphy's bar downtown. I figured maybe I could find some friendly faces, maybe talk to someone who didn't know about my spectacular series of failures. What I needed was a beer and maybe some human conversation that didn't involve pity or judgment. What I got was a final nail in the coffin of my faith in humanity. There they were, sitting in our usual booth, Kate and Tom. My best friend Tom, the guy who was supposed to be my best man at the wedding that was never going to happen. They were holding hands across the table, looking very much like a couple who'd been together for more than a few days. Tom spotted me first, and to his credit, he at least had the decency to look embarrassed. His face went red, and he tried to wave me over like we could all just pretend this was a normal, friendly encounter. Kate just looked relieved, like she'd finally gotten out a commitment that was dragging her down. I stood in that doorway for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 10 seconds, watching my ex-fiancée and my best friend together. It hit me that I hadn't just lost a girlfriend. I'd lost a guy who was supposed to have my back, the person I called crying when Dad died, the friend I'd trusted with everything. I turned around and walked out without saying a word. What was there to say? Hey guys, thanks for twisting the knife while I'm down. Hope you're happy together. Later, I found out from other people that they'd been talking for weeks while I was busy dealing with Dad's death and my sister's betrayal. Apparently, my emotional breakdown wasn't attractive to either of them. They moved in together 2 weeks later, into a nice apartment that Tom could afford because he'd landed a good job at his uncle's insurance company right out of college. Standing outside that bar, watching through the window as they laugh about something, I felt something break inside me that I didn't even know could break. It wasn't just heartbreak. It was a complete collapse of my faith in other human beings. So there I was, 23 years old with everything I'd ever trusted stripped away. Every morning, I'd wake up on my air mattress and stare at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a question mark. I'd count my remaining money, what little I had left after everyone I trusted had taken their piece of me, and try to figure out how to make it last until I could find a job that paid more than minimum wage. The worst part wasn't the money, though. It was the silence. After a lifetime of being surrounded by family and friends, the silence in that little apartment was deafening. No Dad calling me for dinner. No Kate texting me about her day. No Tom sending me stupid memes. Just me, my 2 suitcases, and the sound of my upstairs neighbor's TV bleeding through the thin walls. I started applying for jobs like my life depended on it. Because, well, it kind of did. But here's something nobody tells you about being in a desperate situation. Desperation has its own smell, and employers can detect it from a mile away. Every interview felt like I was begging people to ignore the wreckage trailing behind me. So, Jake, they'd say, looking at my resume, "Tell us about yourself." What was I supposed to say? Well, I trusted my family, and they robbed me blind. My fiancée left me for my best friend, and I'm currently living in what can generously be described as a human storage unit. But I'm a hard worker. I started having conversations with myself just to hear a friendly voice. Pathetic? Absolutely. Necessary for my sanity? Also absolutely. Some nights, I'd lie on that air mattress and think about all the motivational posters hanging in guidance counselors' offices. You know, the ones with the kitten hanging from a tree branch that says, "Hang in there." I wanted to find whoever made those posters and ask them what comes after hanging in there. Because I was hanging in there so hard my arms were about to fall off, and I still couldn't see any light at the end of the tunnel. The really twisted part was how everyone else seemed to be moving on with their lives like nothing had happened. Lizzie posted pictures on Facebook of her redecorating the house. Kate and Tom were apparently planning a vacation together. The world kept spinning while I was stuck in this tiny apartment, eating cereal for dinner and wondering if this was what rock bottom felt like. That's when the universe decided to throw me either a lifeline or another amble to the head. I couldn't tell which at the time. It was a Tuesday, because all life-changing events seem to happen on random Tuesdays when you're not expecting them. I was sitting on my one piece of furniture, this ancient kitchen chair I'd rescued from a garage sale, staring at the stack of bills I couldn't afford to pay, when I heard the mail truck pull up outside. Usually, mail meant more bad news. Credit card, companies asking for money I didn't have, or rejection letters from jobs I was overqualified for but too desperate to turn down. But this time, there was something different mixed in with the usual pile of financial misery. A thick cream-colored envelope with Crenshaw and Boyd, attorneys at law, printed in fancy lettering across the top. Montana address. I figured it was probably some kind of scam. You know, those fake lottery winnings or inheritance schemes that prey on desperate people. But I had my full name typed on it, not just current resident or Jake S. I almost threw it away without opening it. I mean, what were the odds that some random law firm in Montana had legitimate business with a broke 23-year-old from Ohio? But something about the way of the paper, the way it felt substantial and official, made me curious enough to tear it open. The letter was signed by someone named Harold Crenshaw, and it mentioned a will. Specifically, the last will and testament of Ethel Mae Patterson. Aunt Ethel. I had to read it 3 times before the words sank in, because Aunt Ethel was one of those family members you forget exists until someone mentions them at a reunion. Dad's older sister, the one who lived way out in the middle of nowhere and only showed up for major holidays. The family eccentric who never married, lived alone on some kind of farm, and always brought homemade apple butter that tasted like heaven and made the whole house smell like cinnamon for days. As a kid, I'd visited her ranch maybe twice, when I was around 10 years old. Those visits were like stepping into a different world. Wide open spaces, animals everywhere, and this tough old lady who could wrestle a stubborn fence post into submission, and then serve you the best pie you'd ever tasted 20 minutes later. She'd tell these wild stories about her fuzzy wizards, and how they were going to change everything someday. The family always treated her like the weird relative you tolerate, because you have to. She'd show up at Christmas with her wild gray hair and clothes that smelled like hay, talking about her animals like they were people, and her farm like it was some kind of kingdom. Behind her back, they'd roll their eyes and make jokes about crazy Aunt Ethel and her menagerie. But I remembered something different. I remembered the way she looked at me during those childhood visits, like she was seeing something in me that nobody else bothered to look for. She'd ruffle my hair and say things like, "You've got good eyes, Jake. Don't let anybody convince you to stop seeing clearly." According to this letter, Aunt Ethel had died just a week after Dad's funeral. Now that I thought about it, she hadn't been at Dad's service, which was strange because she never missed family events, even the awkward ones. She must have already been sick, too sick to make the trip. Nobody had bothered to tell me she'd passed, which wasn't surprising given how my family had been treating me lately. But apparently, she'd remember me in her will. The letter was formal and legal, full of language I didn't understand, but the bottom line was clear. She'd left me something. Property in Montana. The phrase, including all structures, livestock, and personal effects, jumped out at me from the page like a neon sign. There was something about needing to claim the inheritance in person within 60 days, and a phone number call for more information. I sat there holding this letter, feeling like I was in some kind of alternate reality. Everyone I'd trusted had abandoned me, and now someone I barely knew was throwing me what might be a lifeline from beyond the grave. It felt too good to be true, which in my experience usually meant it was. But what choice did I have? I could stay in my depressing studio apartment, eating ramen noodles and watching my savings account slowly drain to zero while I waited for some minimum wage job to hire me. Or I could take what little money I had left, buy a bus ticket to Montana, and see what Aunt Ethel had left me. Maybe it was desperation talking. But for the first time in months, I felt something that resembled hope stirring in my chest. It was a tiny, fragile thing, like a candle flame in a hurricane, but it was something. I picked up my phone and dialed the number on the letterhead. A gruff voice answered on the third ring. "Crenshaw and Boyd." "Hi," I said, my voice cracking like a teenager's. "My name is Jake Patterson. I got a letter about Aunt Ethel's will." "Ah, Jake." The voice warmed up considerably. "Been wondering when you'd call. Harold Crenshaw here. Sorry for your loss. Son, your aunt was quite a character. Tough as nails and twice as sharp. She talked about you sometimes, you know. That caught me off guard." "She did." "Oh, yes. Said you were the only one in the family who saw past the surface of things. Said you had potential that nobody else recognized." He paused, and I could hear papers rustling. "She was very specific about wanting you to have the ranch. Said if anyone could appreciate what she'd built there, it would be you." I felt tears stinging my eyes, which was embarrassing but unavoidable. After months of being told I was worthless by everyone who was supposed to care about me, hearing that someone had believed in me felt like finding water in the desert. "So what exactly did she leave me?" I asked. Harold chuckled. "Well, that's something you'll need to see for yourself. But I can tell you at a working ranch with about 40 acres, a house, some outbuildings, and—" He paused dramatically. "3 very special animals that she was particularly fond of. She made me promise to tell you that they're fuzzy wizards who will change your life if you're smart enough to listen to them." Even through my emotional fog, I had to smile at that. That was Aunt Ethel. All right. Turning livestock into mystical creatures with her stories. "The thing is," Harold continued, "you need to come out here and claim the inheritance in person. legal requirement. And there are some conditions attached that we'll need to discuss face-to-face. Nothing too complicated, but Ethel was very specific about how she wanted things handled. Conditions. Of course there were conditions. Nothing in my life was ever simple anymore. But what did I have to lose at this point? My dignity was already gone, my savings were almost gone, and my faith in humanity was definitely gone. I looked around my tiny apartment, at the water stain on the ceiling, the stack of unpaid bills, the 2 suitcases that held everything I owned, and made my decision. I'll be there, I told Harold. How soon can I come? How about next week? That'll give me time to get all the paperwork ready. And Jake? Pack for an extended stay. Ethel's ranch is, well, let's just say it's not like anything you're used to. After I hung up, I sat in that chair for a long time, holding the letter and trying to process what had just happened. Maybe this was my chance to start over. Maybe Aunt Ethel, in her weird wisdom, had thrown me exactly the lifeline I needed. Or maybe I was about to discover that the only person who'd ever believed in me had left me a pile of debt and a bunch of farm animals I didn't know how to take care of. Either way, it beat sitting in this apartment feeling sorry for myself while my former life moved on without me. I started making a mental list of what I'd need for the trip. It wasn't a long list. When everything you own fits in 2 suitcases, packing doesn't take much planning. But for the first time in months, I was making plans that looked forward instead of backward. That night, I called the bus station and bought a ticket to Montana. One way, because bridges had been burned and there wasn't much left for me in Ohio anyway. If Aunt Ethel's ranch turned out to be another disappointment, at least it would be a disappointment in a different state. As I lay on my air mattress that last night in the apartment, listening to my neighbor's TV and the distant sound of traffic, I thought about something Aunt Ethel had told me during one of those childhood visits. We'd been sitting on her porch, watching her animals graze in the distance, and she said something that didn't make sense to me at the time. Jake, life has a funny way of disguising gifts as disasters. Sometimes what looks like the worst thing that ever happened to you is actually the universe clearing out the junk so it has room to deliver something better. At 10 years old, I nodded politely and gone back to play with my toys. At 23, broke and betrayed and sleeping on an air mattress in a studio apartment that smelled like failure, those words felt like a prophecy. Maybe losing everything was the universe's way of making space for whatever Aunt Ethel had left me. Maybe this was the beginning of something new, instead of just another ending in a string of endings. I didn't know if I was chasing a miracle or another disaster. But after everything, I figured I could handle whatever Montana had to throw at me, even if it involved fuzzy wizards. The bus ride to Montana took 36 hours and felt like a journey to another planet. I'd never been that far west before, and watching the landscape change from Ohio suburbs to endless prairie was like watching America unfold in fast forward. Cornfields gave way to wheat fields, which gave way to mountains that looked like they'd been photoshopped onto the horizon. I spent most of the trip staring out the window, trying not to think about what I was leaving behind or what I might be walking into. The other passengers were a mix of truckers, college kids, and people who looked like they were running from something, which, I guess, made me fit right in. When I finally stumbled off that Greyhound in Whitefish, Montana, I felt like I'd been transported to a different century. The air was so clean it hurt my lungs, and the silence was the kind that makes city folks nervous. No car horns, no sirens, no sounds of civilization grinding away 24/7. Just wind and the distant sound of what I'd later learn were actual cowboys moving cattle. Harold Crenshaw was waiting for me at the station, exactly like he'd promised. He was easy to spot, a weathered old cowboy who looked like he'd stepped out of a Marlboro commercial, complete with a faded hat that had seen better decades and boots that had probably walked more miles than most people drive. "You must be Jake," he said, gripping my hand with fingers that felt like leather. "Welcome to God's country, son. Hope you're ready for an adventure." The drive to Aunt Ethel's place took another hour down roads that got progressively smaller and more rutted. Harold's pickup truck was older than me and sounded like it was held together by prayer and duct tape, but it ate up those mountain roads like they were nothing. "Your aunt was something else," Harold said, navigating around a pothole the size of a bathtub. "Toughest woman I ever met, and I've known some tough women. Used to say she could outwork any man in the county, and she wasn't wrong. She also said you were the only one in your family worth a damn. That caught me off guard. She really said that? More than once. Said your family treated her like the crazy old aunt, but she saw right through their pretenses. Called them a bunch of vultures circling around your daddy's money. During that bumpy ride, Harold told me more about Aunt Ethel's story. Lost her husband young, never had kids, spent 40 years making this place work when everyone said she was crazy. Tough as nails, that woman. She didn't choose you for this inheritance because you had it easy, Jake. She chose you because she knew you'd understand what it means to start over when everyone's counting you out. Turns out Aunt Ethel had been a better judge of character than I'd given her credit for. As we pulled up to what Harold generously called the property, my heart sank faster than a lead balloon. The house. And I'm using that term very loosely here. Looked like it had been designed by someone who'd heard houses described but had never actually seen one. The roof sagged in the middle like a hammock. The front porch was held up by what appeared to be a car jack and some 2x4s, and the whole structure leaned to one side like it was tired and wanted to lie down. This was the exact opposite of the big, well-maintained house that Lizzie had stolen from me. Where that house had been solid and respectable, this place looked like a strong wind might blow it into the next county. She wasn't much for home maintenance, Harold admitted, following my gaze to a section of siding that was hanging on by 3 nails and a wing and a prayer. Ethel always said the house was just a place to sleep between working with her animals. Speaking of which, he pointed toward a barn that was somehow in even worse shape than the house. That's where you'll find your inheritance. The living part, anyway. Should mention, young Tommy from a neighboring ranch has been looking after them since Ethel passed. Good kid. Been doing it for a few bucks a week just to make sure they didn't starve while we waited for you to show up. Told him yesterday you'd be taking over. The barn smelled like it had been used to store dinosaur remains. I'm talking about a smell so powerful it had its own gravitational pull. It was a combination of hay, manure, wet wool, and something I couldn't identify, but suspected might be the ghost of every farm animal that had ever lived. And then I saw them. 3 creatures that looked like someone had mashed a sheep, a llama, and a glam metal band into one confused animal. They were staring at me with expressions that somehow managed to be both curious and judgmental, like they were trying to decide whether I was worth their time or just another disappointment. Meet Jasmine, Napoleon, and Betsy, Harold said with the kind of pride usually reserved for introducing your grandchildren. Your aunt's pride and joy. They're alpacas, in case you're wondering. Alpacas. Of course they were alpacas. Here I was, 23 years old, homeless, heartbroken, and betrayed by everyone I'd ever trusted, and my inheritance was a falling down house and 3 animals that looked like they'd been rejected from a Dr. Seuss book. Ethel always said they were special, Harold continued, apparently oblivious to my growing sense of doom. She called them her fuzzy wizards, said they were going to change everything someday. Before I could ask what that was supposed to mean, Jasmine. I think it was Jasmine. They all looked the same to me. Walked over to where I was standing and did something I hadn't expected. She spat on my backpack. Not a little dribble. Either. We're talking about a full-on, professional-grade loogie that would have made a baseball player proud. It was like she was making a statement. Welcome to your new life, buddy. Hope you brought a change of clothes. Harold laughed like this was the funniest thing he'd seen all week. That means she likes you. Ethel always said the alpacas were excellent judges of character. If they spit on you, it means you're worth their attention. Great. My new roommate showed affection by covering me in saliva. This was definitely not mentioned in any of the self-help books I'd read about starting over after life kicks you in the teeth. Then Napoleon decided to get in on the action and spat directly on my shoes. Betsy, not to be outdone, aimed for my shirt and scored a direct hit. Yep, Harold nodded approvingly. They definitely like you. Usually takes some days to even acknowledge new people. Harold spent another hour showing me around the property, pointing out the well, the feed storage, and the basic maintenance requirements. He handed me his business card and a folder full of veterinary records and feeding instructions. I'll check on you in a few days, he said, climbing back into his ancient pickup. Don't be afraid to call if you need anything. And Jake, give it time. This place has a way of growing on you. After Harold left with Final Wave, I stood there alone with my inheritance, dripping with alpaca spit, looking at the dilapidated bar in the house that appeared to be held together by good intentions and old paint. That's when it hit me, and I cried. Not the dignified, single tear rolling down the cheek, kind of crying you see in movies. This was ugly crying, the kind where your face gets red and your nose runs, and you make sounds that would embarrass a wounded animal. I cried from frustration, from exhaustion, from the sheer absurdity of my situation. Here I was, supposedly inheriting property, and it looked like a set piece from a post-apocalyptic movie. The family house that should have been mine was solid and beautiful, and I was standing in what amounted to a very expensive pile of sticks and animal hair. As I wiped my face with my sleeve, I remembered Harold's words about Aunt Ethel starting over when everyone counted her out. Looking around at my new kingdom of dysfunction, the house falling apart, the barn that smelled like a medieval siege, and my new business partners who were livestock with attitude problems and questionable hygiene habits, I realized something. I'd inherited a mess, but for the first time, it was a mess that came with a second chance. But it was mine. I spent the first night sleeping on a mattress that felt like it was stuffed with rocks and disappointment. The house had electricity, barely, and running water that came out brown for the first 5 minutes before clearing up to a rusty orange. The heating system was a wood-burning stove that looked like it had been installed during the Coolidge administration. I lay there listening to the sounds of rural Montana, wind through the mountains, the distant howl of what I hoped were coyotes and not wolves, an occasional snort or shuffle from the barn where my 3 fuzzy inheritances were presumably plotting my demise. This was not how I'd imagined my life going when I was a kid dreaming about my future. 23 years old, sleeping in a house that belonged in a horror movie, with a bank account that was approaching zero and no marketable skills beyond knowing how to operate a cash register and make a decent cup of coffee. The next morning, I decided to explore the property and get a better sense of what exactly Aunt Ethel had left me. The 40 acres stretched out in every direction, most of it pasture land where the alpacas could graze. There were fence lines that needed repair, outbuildings that needed attention, and approximately 17,000 things that needed fixing, cleaning, or replacing. But there was something else too. Something I hadn't noticed a day before when I was too busy feeling sorry for myself. The land was beautiful. Rolling hills stretched toward mountains that looked like they'd been painted by someone who really understood dramatic lighting. The grass was that particular shade of green that only exists in places where the air is clean and the soil is rich. And the silence, the kind of deep, profound quiet that makes you realize how much noise pollution you've been living with your entire life. I spent the morning getting acquainted with Jasmine, Napoleon, and Betsy, which mostly involved them staring at me suspiciously, while I tried to figure out what exactly you're supposed to do with alpacas. They had food, large bales of hay that Aunt Ethel had apparently stockpiled before she died. They had water from a well that pumped clean, cold mountain water. They had shelter in the form of a 3-sided lean-to that was actually in better shape than the house. What they didn't have was any apparent respect for human authority. When I tried to lead Jasmine to a different part of the pasture, she looked at me like I'd suggested we go bungee jumping off the barn roof. When I attempted to brush Napoleon's coat, he stepped sideways and nearly knocked me into the water trough. Betsy just watched the whole show with what I swear was amusement. It was while I was cleaning out their shelter area, a job that requires a strong stomach and a weak sense of smell, that I found it. Hidden under a pile of old wool blankets that had seen better decades was a wooden box, weathered, hand-carved, with a brass lock that looked like it belonged in a pirate movie, but it was locked tight, and I had no idea where to find a key. I spent the next hour searching the barn, checking every corner, every loose board, every possible hiding spot. Nothing. Then I moved to the house, going through drawers that stuck, cabinets that creaked, and even lifting loose floorboards that groaned under my weight. I was about to give up when I decided to check the living room one more time. There was an old bookshelf against the far wall, filled with farming manuals, romance novels, and cookbooks that looked like they'd been there since the Carter administration. I was pulling books out randomly when my fingers found something behind a dusty cookbook titled Mountain Living for Beginners. An old brass key. The key fit the lock perfectly. Inside the box was a collection of items that told a story I was just beginning to understand. There was an old map of the property, hand-drawn, and marked with symbols I didn't recognize. Photographs of Aunt Ethel as a young woman, standing next to alpacas that looked remarkably similar to my 3 current roommates. Newspaper clippings from local papers, dating back 20 years, with headlines like "Local Woman's Will Win State Fair" and "Montana Ranch Produces Prize-Winning Fiber." But the most important thing in that box was a leather-bound journal that smelled like apple butter and old dreams. The first entry was dated 40 years ago, written in Aunt Ethel's distinctive handwriting. Golden Thread Acres, Day 1. They all think I'm crazy for buying alpacas, but I know something they don't. This isn't just about animals. This is about creating something beautiful in a world that seems determined to ugly itself up. I flipped through pages and pages of entries, tracking the development of what Aunt Ethel called her grand experiment. She wrote about breeding programs, about developing specific genetic lines, about producing wool that was softer and warmer than anything else on the market. She wrote about setbacks and successes, about neighbors who thought she was wasting her time, and about a vision that went far beyond just raising livestock. And then, near the end of the journal, I found an entry that was clearly meant for me. Jake, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you're probably standing in that barn wondering what the hell you've gotten yourself into. I know the place looks rough around the edges, but that's just the surface. What you've inherited isn't just land and animals. It's 40 years of work developing the finest alpaca bloodlines in North America. Jasmine, Napoleon, and Betsy aren't just pets. They're the descendants of champions, and their wool is worth more than most people make in a year. I sat down hard on a bale of hay, reading and rereading those words. Worth more than most people make in a year? I looked over at Jasmine, who was currently using the fence post as a scratching post, and tried to reconcile this information with the reality of my situation. The journal went on. The secret isn't in the animals themselves. It's in understanding what makes them special. Their wool isn't just soft. It's thermoregulating, hypoallergenic, and naturally antimicrobial. I've spent decades developing these bloodlines, and what you have now is the culmination of all that work. The map in this box shows where I've hidden documentation of their lineage, certification papers, and breeding records. The best things I've made, I had to protect, not just from weather, but from family who get greedy when they see paper that smells like money. That last line hit me like a punch to the gut. Aunt Ethel had known exactly what kind of people she was dealing with when it came to our family. She'd hidden the proof of her life's work because she understood that some people see value and immediately want to take it for themselves. I pulled out the hand-drawn map and studied it carefully. There were X marks at various locations around the property, each one presumably marking a location of hidden documents or supplies. It was like Aunt Ethel had turned her ranch into a treasure hunt, complete with clues and hidden prizes. But the best part was the final entry in the journal. Don't let anyone tell you that you can't make this work, Jake. I've watched your family, and most of them wouldn't recognize opportunity if it walked up and introduced itself. But you're different. You've got your grandfather's eyes. You see things other people miss. The alpacas will spit on you. The work will be harder than anything you've ever done, and there will be days when you want to give up and go back to whatever safe, small life you were living before. But if you stick with it, if you learn to listen to what these animals are trying to teach you, you'll discover something most people never find: the satisfaction of building something beautiful with your own hands. I closed the journal and looked around the barn with completely different eyes. This wasn't just a collection of falling down buildings and stubborn animals. This was a business that had been 40 years in the making, disguised as a disaster and handed to me by a woman who believed in me when no one else would. Jasmine wandered over to where I was sitting and, instead of spitting on me, gently nudged my shoulder with her nose. For the first time since arriving in Montana, I felt something that resembled hope stirring in my chest. Maybe Aunt Ethel hadn't been the crazy old woman everyone thought she was. Maybe she'd been a visionary who'd spent decades building something extraordinary, waiting for the right person to come along and appreciate what she created. And maybe, just maybe, I was that person. I spent the rest of the day studying the map and planning my treasure hunt. Tomorrow, I'd start following the clues Aunt Ethel had left for me. Tonight, I'd sleep in my falling down house, listening to my three fuzzy business partners settling in for the night, and dream about possibilities I was just beginning to understand. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was thinking about what I might be able to build, even if it involved learning to communicate with creatures whose primary form of social interaction was creative spitting. I didn't know where to start, but I knew giving up wasn't an option. My teachers became YouTube, Reddit, and three alpacas who seemed to think I was their personal entertainment system. I learned to shear wool without getting spit in my eye and clean the barn without losing consciousness from the smell. It was like getting a PhD in animal husbandry from the University of Hard Knocks, with a minor in creative cursing. Jasmine, Napoleon, and Betsy became my therapists. I'd tell them about Lizzie stealing my house, about Kate breaking my heart, about how I went from having a future to sleeping in a barn that smelled like a medieval siege. And they never interrupted me, except to spit, which I'd learned was their way of saying they were listening. The first few weeks were brutal. I was learning everything from scratch: how to properly feed alpacas, how to maintain their shelter, how to recognize signs of illness. YouTube became my lifeline, and I must have watched every alpaca-related video on the platform. Some kid in Peru taught me shearing techniques. A woman in New Zealand showed me how to sort wool by quality, and a grizzled rancher from Colorado explained breeding basics, using language that would make a sailor blush. But slowly, things started clicking. The alpacas began tolerating me, which in their world apparently meant they only spit on me twice a day instead of every hour. I figured out their personalities. Jasmine was the alpha female with attitude problems. Napoleon was the anxious middle child who overthought everything. And Betsy was the wise old grandmother who watched everything with amusement. Following Aunt Ethel's treasure map led me to documents that blew my mind. Hidden in waterproof containers buried around the property were breeding certificates, genetic lineage charts, and competition records dating back decades. These weren't just random farm animals. They were descendants of championship bloodlines worth more than my dad's truck had been. The wool quality documentation was insane. Aunt Ethel had been conducting what amounted to a 40-year science experiment, selectively breeding for fineness, strength, and natural properties that most people didn't even know existed. The lab report showed micron counts that would make cashmere jealous and thermal regulation properties that NASA would probably be interested in. But the real treasure was a contact list of high-end textile buyers, artisan weavers, and boutique clothing designers who had been purchasing Aunt Ethel's wool for years. These people paid premium prices for quality, and they'd been wondering where their supplier had gone. I spent 3 months learning the business from the ground up. Shearing season was like boot camp designed by someone who hated me personally. My hand got cut up, my back ached constantly, and I discovered muscles I didn't know I had. But when I held that first batch of cleaned, sorted wool in my hands, I understood what Aunt Ethel had been talking about. This stuff was gold, literally golden in color, softer than anything I'd ever felt, and so fine it seemed to glow in the sunlight. I did some research and found out that top-quality alpaca wool was selling for anywhere from $40 to $200 per pound, depending on the grade and processing. I had about 15 pounds of premium fiber from that first shearing. Simple math told me I was holding somewhere between $600 and $3,000 worth of raw material. Not bad for 3 months of getting spit on by creatures with questionable attitudes. My first sale was accidental. I'd posted some pictures on Facebook, mostly to prove to myself that I wasn't completely losing my mind in the Montana wilderness. A college friend commented asking if I was selling any of it, and before I knew it, I was packaging up 2 pounds of Jasmine's finest wool and shipping it to a knitting enthusiast in Portland for $92. That sale changed everything. If one random person on Facebook was willing to pay nearly $50 a pound for wool they'd only seen in a photo, what would happen if I actually tried to market this stuff properly? I spent the next week learning about Etsy, setting up an online store, and taking product photos that didn't look like they'd been shot during an earthquake. My product descriptions were basic: premium alpaca wool from Montana Ranch, but I included the story about inheriting the farm and learning from animals with personality disorders. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My first listing, 2-pound what I called baby jasmine blend, sold within an hour for $92. Then the orders started coming in faster than I could process them. People weren't just buying wool. They were buying into the story of a young guy starting over with 3 alpacas and a dream. Within a month, I was completely sold out and had a waiting list longer than the line at a Black Friday sale. Customers were leaving reviews that sounded like love letters, talking about how soft the wool was, how beautiful the colors were, and how it spun into yarn that felt like a cloud made of happiness. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I joined TikTok. Now, I want to be clear about something. A 23-year-old guy from Ohio posting videos about alpaca farming wasn't exactly what anyone would call a guaranteed viral hit. But I had one thing going for me that most TikTok creators didn't: authenticity born from desperation, and alpacas with serious attitude problems. My first video was simple. I filmed myself trying to brush Napoleon while explaining that alpaca wool was softer than cashmere and warmer than anything you could buy in stores. Halfway through my explanation, Napoleon turned and spit directly into the camera lens. The video ended with me wiping alpaca saliva off my phone while laughing like a maniac. I posted it with a caption, "When your business partner has strong opinions about marketing," and went to bed thinking maybe 12 people would see it. I woke up to 1,700,000 views. 1,700,000. The comments were exploding faster than I could read them. People were tagging their friends, sharing the video, and demanding to know where they could buy this magical spit-enhanced wool. My phone was buzzing so constantly I thought it was broken. The video hit over 1 million views by the end of the day, and suddenly everyone wanted to know about the guy with the spitting alpacas, who made wool that cost more than most people's grocery budget. I started posting daily content, sharing tutorials, alpaca personality profiles, behind-the-scenes footage of farm life. Every video was different, but they all had one thing in common. My 3 furry business partners were natural comedians with perfect timing for interrupting serious moments with well-placed projectile saliva. The breakthrough came when I posted a video explaining the actual science behind why alpaca wool was worth the premium price. I talked about micron diameter, thermal regulation, hypoallergenic properties, and sustainability, while Jasmine demonstrated each point by doing something ridiculous in the background: eating my notes, stepping in the water bucket, or giving me judgmental looks that somehow perfectly matched my explanations. That video got picked up by some major accounts and exploded across multiple platforms. Suddenly, I wasn't just alpaca guy. I was being featured in articles about sustainable farming, interviewed on agricultural podcasts, and invited to speak at fiber arts conventions. The orders were pouring in faster than I could fulfill them. I was selling wool faster than I could produce it, and the prices kept climbing. What started as $40 wool was now commanding $200 per pound, with customers fighting over limited releases like they were concert tickets. 6 months after that first TikTok video, I got the call that changed everything. A producer from a reality show called America's Strangest Success Stories wanted to feature me in an episode about unconventional businesses. They offered to pay my travel expenses, put me up in a nice hotel, and give me national television exposure. The filming was surreal. Here I was, the same guy who'd been sleeping on an air mattress in a studio apartment less than a year ago, being interviewed for national television about my alpaca wool business that was bringing in more money than I'd ever imagined possible. Jasmine, Napoleon, and Betsy were naturals in front of the cameras, performing their spitting routine with Oscar-worthy timing. The episode aired 3 weeks later, and my website crashed from traffic within the first hour. I was getting orders from boutique designers in New York, knitting circles in Seattle, and craft enthusiasts from countries I couldn't pronounce. Golden Thread Acres went from a local oddity to an internationally recognized brand literally overnight. Success changed everything faster than I was prepared for. I had to hire help. Local teenagers who thought working with spitting animals was hilarious, and retired farmers who understood the wool business better than I did. I upgraded the barn facilities, installed proper processing equipment, and even got business cards that didn't look like they'd been printed at a gas station. The money was insane. What started as a desperate attempt to make rent money had turned into a six-figure business in just over a year. I was selling breeding rights to Napoleon's offspring for thousands of dollars, and people were willing to pay premium prices just to visit the farm and meet the alpacas who become internet celebrities. I got a few offers to move the operation to LA or Austin, but I knew what I found here couldn't be replicated in a warehouse. The magic wasn't just in the animals. It was in this place, this land that Aunt Ethel had spent decades nurturing. I bought a decent truck, fixed the house, and even opened a savings account for the first time in my adult life. But the best part wasn't the money. It was proving that Aunt Ethel had been right about everything. Her crazy alpacas really were golden, and her faith in me hadn't been misplaced. That's when Lizzie showed up. I was outside the barn, filming a video about seasonal wool care, when I saw a familiar car pulling up the driveway. My stomach dropped faster than a lead balloon. Lizzie's BMW, gleaming like new money and bad intentions. She climbed out wearing designer sunglasses and that perfectly practiced smile that had fooled me so many times before. The audacity was breathtaking. This was the same person who'd watched me lose everything and decided I wasn't worth her time. Now she was standing on my property like we were old friends meeting for a reunion. The conversation started with fake concern about how I was doing, how she'd been following my success on social media, and how she'd always known I had potential. The lies came so smoothly, I almost admired the craftsmanship. She told me how proud she was of what I'd accomplished, how creative and entrepreneurial I'd become. She mentioned seeing my TikTok videos and reading articles about my business. It was all very supportive and sisterly, which made it even more disgusting. Then came the real pitch. She suggested we should team up, combine our resources, and really scale the business properly. She talked about franchise opportunities, expansion plans, and leveraging the brand across multiple platforms. She had business connections, marketing expertise, and capital to invest. She painted a picture of Golden Thread Acres becoming a national empire, with locations across the country and product lines in major retailers. She made it sound like she was doing me a favor by offering to help turn my little farm into a corporate success story. I listened to the whole presentation without saying a word, watching her face as she got more animated and excited about spending money I'd earned with alpacas she'd never wanted to meet. When she finished her pitch, I looked at her for a long moment. Then I started laughing. Not polite chuckling, deep, genuine laughter that came from somewhere around my boots and worked its way up. I laughed until my sides hurt, until tears ran down my face, until she started looking uncomfortable and confused. I told her I remembered everything. How she'd tricked me into signing away my inheritance when I was grieving and vulnerable. How she'd stolen a house that Dad promised would be mine, using legal paperwork I was too devastated to read properly. How she'd thrown me out on the street with nothing but 2 suitcases while she moved into the home where I'd grown up. I reminded her that she'd built her comfortable life on a foundation of lies and manipulation, taking advantage of my trust when I was at my lowest point. She'd written me off as someone who'd never amount to anything, never expecting that the broken guy she cheated would build something better than anything she could imagine. But success had a funny way of making people suddenly remember they cared about you. Her face changed as I talked. The fake smile disappeared, replaced by expressions that ranged from embarrassment to anger. She tried to interrupt with excuses about how complicated the inheritance situation had been, how she thought I needed space to figure things out, how she'd always believed in me even when it didn't look that way. But I wasn't buying any of it. I'd learned too much about recognizing authenticity versus performance, thanks to 3 alpacas who never pretended to be anything other than exactly what they were. I told her that my alpacas had taught me something important about character. Genuine relationships are built on consistency, not convenience. Jasmine, Napoleon, and Betsy had been spitting on me from day one, but they'd also been there every single day, through every failure and small victory. They'd never abandoned me when things got tough or suddenly shown up when things got profitable. And then Jasmine, with impeccable timing, did what no words could. She walked over and spit directly into Lizzie's face. It wasn't just a little spray either. We're talking about a full-on professional-grade loogie that hit her right in the cheek and sent her perfectly applied makeup running down her face in colorful streaks. Lizzie's mouth dropped open in shock. Her designer sunglasses askew, looking like a very expensive abstract painting that someone had left out in the rain. I couldn't help it. I burst out laughing again. It was like Jasmine had been listening to the whole conversation and decided to offer her professional opinion on the proceedings. These animals really were excellent judges of character. Lizzie left shortly after that, but not before I caught the look in her eyes. It wasn't defeat, it was calculation. She was already figuring out her next angle, her next approach. This wasn't over, and we both knew it. As I watched her BMW disappear down the driveway, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger or satisfaction, but a kind of sad clarity about who people really are when you strip away all the pretty words and social expectations. A couple of days later, my phone started buzzing. Instagram notifications, then Facebook, then text messages. Kate had found me on social media. The messages started innocently enough. Congratulations on my success, how proud she was of what I'd accomplished, how she'd always known I was capable of great things. Classic Kate, trying to rewrite history with selective memory and careful word choices. She told me she'd been thinking about me, about us, about how things had ended between us. She said she'd made mistakes, that she'd been scared and confused after my dad died. She wanted to talk, to explain, to maybe start over if I was open to it. The messages kept coming over the next few days. Photos of places we used to go together, memories of better times, hints about how unhappy she was with Tom and how she'd realized what she'd lost when she let me go. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, perfectly crafted to hit every weak spot she thought I still had. The old me, the broken guy who'd left Ohio with nothing but 2 suitcases and a broken heart, might have fallen for it. But I wasn't that guy anymore. I'd learned something important from my alpacas about trust and consistency. Real relationships don't disappear when things get hard and magically reappear when things get profitable. People who abandon you at your lowest point don't get to celebrate with you at your highest. I didn't respond to any of the messages. I didn't block her either. I wanted to see how far she'd go, how desperate she'd get when she realized I wasn't taking the bait. Meanwhile, Tom was playing a different game entirely. No direct contact, no emotional manipulation, just strategic social media engagement. He liked my posts, comment occasionally with supportive messages, share my content with captions about how impressed he was with my transformation. It was subtle, calculated, and probably effective with people who didn't understand what he was really doing. He was positioning himself as a supportive friend who'd always believed in me, just waiting for the right moment to cash in on that narrative. But here's the thing about building something real from nothing. It changes you in ways that people from your old life can't understand. Success wasn't just about the money or the recognition. It was about proving to myself that I could take the worst thing that ever happened to me and turn it into the best thing I'd ever done. That night, I sat in the barn with my 3 business partners, processing the day's events while they munched hay and occasionally offered editorial comments in the form of strategic spitting. I'd built something real here. Not bad for a guy who started with 2 suitcases, a broken heart, and a barn that smelled like the end of the world. Something that was mine, that nobody could take away with legal documents or broken promises. Something that grew from nothing but hard work, weird animals, and the kind of stubborn determination that comes from having no other choice. Tomorrow I get back to work. Keep building, keep growing. But tonight, I was content to sit with my alpacas and appreciate how far we'd all come. The people from my past could keep circling like vultures, waiting for their chance to swoop in and claim their piece of what I'd built. But they misunderstood something fundamental about what had happened here. This wasn't just a business success story. This was a transformation. And transformations, unlike bank accounts, can't be split up in legal documents or stolen with pretty words and false promises. Even if the road ahead was probably going to involve more family drama and definitely more creative spitting. I thought I'd reached the top of the mountain, but life decided to remind me that peaks are just places where it's easier to fall from. Success, as it turns out, has a way of painting a target on your back for everyone who wants to take a shot. It started with Jasmine getting sick. My first alpaca, my spitting muse, my furry business partner who'd been with me since day one. She started acting off. Her eyes, which usually looked at me with that perfect blend of affection and disdain that only alpacas can master, were dim and lifeless. She wasn't eating properly, wasn't spitting with her usual enthusiasm, and worst of all, she seemed to have lost interest in judging my life choices. The local vet came out to take a look, but country vets aren't exactly alpaca specialists. He poked around, took some samples, and gave me the kind of non-answer that makes your stomach drop to somewhere around your boots. Might be a virus, could be stress. Hard to say with exotic animals. Best to isolate her from the others just in case. Isolate Jasmine. The thought of separating her from Napoleon and Betsy felt like breaking up a family that had already been through enough together. But I didn't have a choice. I set up a makeshift quarantine area in the old tool shed and watched my star performer look at me like I'd personally betrayed everything she'd ever believed in. The timing couldn't have been worse. I had orders backed up for months, television interviews scheduled, and a brand that was built entirely around the personalities of 3 specific animals. If something happened to Jasmine, it wasn't just my heart that would be broken. It would be my entire business model. Then the rumors started. Social media has a way of turning whispers into screams faster than you can say viral content. Someone posted a comment asking why Jasmine hadn't appeared in my recent videos. Someone else speculated that maybe there was something wrong with my animals. A third person suggested that perhaps my wool wasn't as safe and natural as I claimed. Within 48 hours, my comment sections looked like a conspiracy theory convention. People were demanding answers, asking for health certificates, wondering if my alpacas were carriers of some exotic disease that could contaminate their knitting projects. The same people who'd been singing my praises just days before were now treating me like I was trying to sell them wool made from radioactive sheep. Orders started getting canceled. Customers who'd been on waiting lists for months were suddenly requesting refunds. My Etsy ratings dropped faster than a lead balloon, and my TikTok comments turned into a digital lynch mob of concerned craft enthusiasts and armchair veterinarians. The irony was devastating. The same authenticity and transparency that had built my brand was now destroying it. I'd always been honest about the ups and downs of farm life, but apparently, people only wanted the cute, funny parts of the story. Nobody wanted to hear about sick animals and veterinary uncertainty when they were spending $200 on premium wool. I felt like I was back in that studio apartment, watching everything I had built crumble around me. The same cold fear in my chest, the same nauseating certainty that I was about to lose everything again. Except this time, it wasn't just my life falling apart. It was the lives of 3 animals who depended on me. I locked myself in the barn where it all started, holding Aunt Ethel's journal like it was some kind of holy book that might contain the answers to problems I didn't even understand. Her words about not giving up felt like mockery in the face of what seemed like inevitable disaster. How do you not give up when a universe seems determined to tear down everything you've worked for? But I couldn't just sit there feeling sorry for myself while Jasmine was sick and my business was imploding. I started digging through every document Aunt Ethel had left behind, looking for anything that might help. Medical records, breeding notes, correspondence with other ranchers, anything that might give me a clue about what was happening. That's when I found it, buried under a stack of old photographs showing Aunt Ethel with alpacas from decades past. A yellow document that looked like it had been handwritten 40 years ago, titled Lumos Generation 3 Breeding Program. Confidential research notes. Aunt Ethel's handwriting was harder to read in the older documents, but what I could make out was incredible. She'd been working on something she called genetic resistance enhancement long before most people even knew what DNA was. Her notes described a specific bloodline that showed natural immunity to common alpaca ailments, enhanced wool quality, and what she termed exceptional longevity characteristics. According to her research, the Lumos Gen 3 line wasn't just resistant to disease. They were practically immune to the viral infections that commonly affected alpaca populations. She'd spent decades selectively breeding for these traits, creating what amounted to a super strain of alpacas that could thrive in conditions that would devastate normal herds. The kicker? Jasmine, Napoleon, and Betsy were all direct descendants of her final Lumos Gen 3 breeding program. I called every veterinary university within driving distance, Finally finding a professor at Colorado State who specialized in genetic research and was willing to listen to what probably sounded like the desperate ramblings of a young farmer who'd watched too many science fiction movies. Dr. Sarah Martinez agreed to test samples from all 3 of my alpacas, though I could hear the skepticism in her voice when I explained what I'd found in Aunt Ethel's notes. She probably thought I was another internet entrepreneur trying to create a marketing gimmick out of thin air. The wait for results felt like waiting for election returns when your entire future depends on the outcome. Every day that passed was another day of canceled orders, negative reviews, and social media speculation. My brand was bleeding money and reputation faster than I could plug the holes. Then Dr. Martinez called with results that changed everything. Not only were my alpacas carriers of the genetic markers Aunt Ethel had documented, but they represented what might be the last pure breeding line of the specific genetic variant in North America. What Jasmine was experiencing wasn't an illness. It was her immune system fighting off a virus that would have devastated a normal alpaca. She was actually proving the effectiveness of 40 years of careful genetic selection. The test results showed genetic markers that indicated resistance to viral infections, enhanced wool production, and longevity factors that could extend the productive lifespan by years beyond normal alpacas. I wasn't just raising farm animals. I was a custodian of what amounted to a living genetic treasure. Dr. Martinez put me in touch with agricultural journalists, genetic researchers, and industry specialists who confirmed what Aunt Ethel had somehow known decades before anyone else. My alpacas weren't just valuable. They were historically significant. Universities wanted to study them. Agricultural programs wanted to partner with me. And suddenly everyone who'd been running away from my diseased animals wanted to get in line to work with my genetically superior breeding stock. I released a press statement titled Golden Thread Acres reveals Lumos Gen 3, America's last genetic treasure. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Agricultural magazines wanted exclusive interviews. Genetic research foundations offered partnerships. And my order backlog went from 0 to 6 months overnight. The same social media platforms that had been crucifying me just weeks before were now celebrating my incredible scientific discovery and dedication to preserving agricultural heritage. It was like watching public opinion do a complete 180 in real time. But the real validation came when Jasmine recovered completely and stronger than ever. Her coat was shinier, her attitude was even more judgmental than usual, and her spitting accuracy had somehow improved to sniper-level precision. It was like she'd leveled up after proving her genetic superiority to the world. Orders weren't just coming back. They were coming with premium pricing attached. People who'd been paying $200 per pound were now offering $500 for Lumos Gen 3 certified wool. I went from having a failing business to having breeding rights worth more than most people's houses. Within 6 months, I'd licensed breeding rights to agricultural programs across 3 states for $800,000, with ongoing royalty agreements that would pay me for the next 20 years. My wool was being shipped to fashion designers in Paris, specialty textile manufacturers in Japan, and boutique shops in cities I couldn't pronounce. Success the second time around felt different than the first. It wasn't just about proving I could build something from nothing. It was about understanding that setbacks aren't endings. They're plot twists in a longer story. I expanded the farm operation, but not in the way people expected. Instead of maximizing production and profit, I turned Golden Thread Acres into something Aunt Ethel would have been proud of, a working educational center where people could learn about sustainable farming, genetic conservation, and the value of preserving agricultural heritage. I started accepting apprentices, young people who, like me, had gotten knocked down by life and needed somewhere to rebuild, kids who'd aged out of foster care, college graduates drowning in debt, people who'd lost jobs and needed to learn new skills. They came to work with alpacas and left understanding something deeper about resilience and the satisfaction of building something meaningful with your own hands. The program wasn't charity, it was investment. These people worked their butts off learning everything from animal husbandry to business management, and many of them went on to start their own sustainable farming operations. I was creating a network of people who understood that real success isn't just about making money. It's about building something that makes the world a little bit better. Today I've got 48 alpacas, each one a teacher in their own right. They've taught me that spitting is an insult. It's a reminder to keep your head up even when people are slinging mud. My wool is sold in boutiques from Montana to Manhattan, and my breeding program is helping preserve genetic diversity that might otherwise have been lost forever. I've got a house that doesn't leak when it rains, a truck that starts on cold mornings, and relationships with people who were there before the money and will be there after it. But most importantly, I've got the knowledge that everything I built came from the worst day of my life, getting transformed into the foundation for the best life I could imagine. The people from my past still circle around occasionally, looking for their piece of what I've created. Lizzie sends business proposals through lawyers now, trying to find legal angles to claim partnership rights. Kate's Instagram stories occasionally feature throwback photos of us together, with captions about how proud she is of my success. Tom shares my content religiously, positioning himself as a friend who always knew I'd make it. But here's what they don't understand. This isn't the same person they betrayed. I'm not the broken kid who signed papers without reading them or trusted people who saw me as disposable. I've learned to recognize authenticity from performance, consistency from convenience, and genuine relationships from opportunistic networking. When people ask me what the secret is, I quote Aunt Ethel, "Sometimes you have to dig through a lot of manure to find the treasure." I've forgiven Lizzie, Kate, and Tom, not because they deserved it, but because I deserve the peace that comes with letting go of anger that was eating me alive. They're still out there looking for their golden thread, their shortcut to success, their angle to profit from other people's work. But I've already found mine, and it was exactly where Aunt Ethel said it would be, in a barn that smelled like the end of the world, with 3 furry wizards who taught me that sometimes the best things in life come disguised as disasters. There's a sign at the entrance to Golden Thread Acres now. Here, only the chosen get spit on. Consider it your first lesson. Life spit on me for years, but I learned to spit back with a smile. And if you're willing to roll up your sleeves, get your hands dirty, and learn from creatures who never pretend to be anything other than exactly what they are, your golden thread is waiting too. Mine was hiding in a barn with 3 hairy wizards who knew something about resilience that took me 24 years to figure out. Success isn't about avoiding the spit. It's about earning the right to be worth spitting on in the first place. And trust me, once you understand that lesson, everything else becomes a lot clearer, even when it involves projectile saliva and animals with questionable attitudes.